In 1984, a boy vanished at the county fair without a trace. 11 years later, a janitor opening a rusted locker in an abandoned school finds a bundle of prize tickets with the boy's name on them, triggering a cold case investigation that will uncover a hidden past, a forgotten witness, and the truth about what really happened that summer afternoon. In the fall of 1995, the halls of Milton Middle School echoed only with the sound of demolition crews and the scrape of rusted lockers being pried from the walls. The building had been closed for nearly a decade, shuttered and forgotten, its linoleum tiles faded, its windows thick with dust. On a rainy Tuesday morning, just after the power was cut to the east wing, a janitor named Phil Maddox was tasked with clearing out the final row of lockers along the back hallway. Most were empty, their contents long since claimed or discarded, but one near the end, number 309, refused to open with the master key. With a grunt and a crowbar, Phil forced the door loose. A burst of stale air and dust hit his face, and as he waved it away, his flashlight beam caught on something inside. Resting in the back corner was a small manila envelope, brittle at the edges and spotted with mildew. He pulled it out, gave it a gentle shake, and a handful of faded carnival prize tickets slid onto the floor. At first glance, they looked like any old fair souvenir, a kid's forgotten stash of winnings. But when Phil picked up the envelope again and turned it over, he froze. Written in ballpoint pen, in shaky all-caps letters, was a name. Corey Wilkes, 1984. Phil didn't say a word. He simply stood there for a long moment, the envelope pinched between his fingers and his breath held tight in his chest. He remembered that name. Everyone in town did. Corey Wilkes, the 12-year-old boy who vanished without a trace at the Milton County Fair. 1 minute, he was holding a fistful of tickets at the ring toss booth, laughing with his friends. The next, he was gone. No suspects, no leads, no goodbyes, just gone. Phil looked back inside the locker. Empty. No books, no jacket, just the smell of rust and time. He squatted down and slowly began gathering the scattered tickets, placing them back inside the envelope like handling something sacred. Then he stood, locked eyes with the empty space, and whispered under his breath, almost apologetically, "You've been here all this time." That afternoon he drove the envelope straight to the Milton Police Department and placed it in the hands of someone who might finally know what to do with it. Detective Lila Monroe turned the envelope over in her gloved hands, her eyes narrowing at the faded name etched in blue ink, Corey Wilkes. The name stirred something in her memory, like a distant whisper she couldn't quite place. The envelope was brittle, the paper curled with time, but inside were nearly 24 prize tickets, sun-bleached, damp at the corners, and reeking faintly of mold. They were the kind of tickets you'd win at a carnival booth for tossing a ring over a bottle or knocking down milk cans. Each one still bore the logo of the 1984 Milton County Fair. Lila had only been in Milton for 4 months, transferred from Omaha after a burnout case left her needing smaller fires to put out, but even she knew about Corey Wilkes. His name lingered like an unfinished sentence in this town. A boy who disappeared on the busiest day of the year, surrounded by people, yet never seen again. The case had gone cold before she ever pinned on a badge, but it still came up now and then, in backroom whispers and community board photos. A name on missing posters that had long since faded in windows and hearts alike. She laid the tickets out across her desk, arranging them in 2 neat rows. Some had numbers still legible, others were too worn to read. One had a small doodle on the back, a star with a smiley face drawn in pencil. She exhaled slowly and opened the old case file. The first page showed a school photo of Corey in a striped red shirt, smiling too wide for someone who clearly hated picture day. She studied it closely, matching the boy's eyes to the name on the envelope, to the tickets splayed before her like breadcrumbs. The report said Corey had gone missing between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, last seen near the game booths by a group of his friends, laughing, carrying a stack of prize tickets he'd been saving up all summer. No witnesses saw him leave. No camera footage, no screams, no sign of struggle, just a boy who vanished while people stood within feet of him. Lila leaned back in her chair and said quietly to herself, "He never left that fair with these tickets. So how the hell did they end up in a school locker 11 years later?" The Milton County Fair in 1984 was the biggest event the town had seen in years. It was the kind of summer day that felt suspended in time, cicadas buzzing in the trees, the scent of kettle corn in the air, and families packed shoulder to shoulder along the midway. Corey Wilkes had been there with his older brother Ben and a few neighborhood kids. He wore his red striped shirt and his favorite white sneakers that always came untied. What he talked about most that day wasn't the rides or the food, but the tickets he'd saved for weeks, mowing lawns and running errands, determined to win something big. According to Ben's statement at the time, Corey had been fixated on a prize shelf above the ring toss booth. A toy sheriff's badge, a small plastic guitar, a snow globe with a miniature Ferris wheel inside. None of it was worth more than a few bucks, but to Corey it might as well have been treasure. He won round after round, collecting ticket after ticket, until he had nearly 30 in hand. Around 4 in the afternoon he told Ben he was going to trade them in and would meet him near the cotton candy stand in 15 minutes. That was the last time anyone saw him. At first, no one panicked. The fairgrounds were crowded and it wasn't unusual for kids to wander off. But when the sun dipped below the trees, and Corey still hadn't shown up, Ben started asking around. Volunteers called out his name over the loudspeaker. His mother, already nervous, had a sinking feeling the moment she arrived and saw Ben pacing alone. By nightfall, the sheriff had cordoned off sections of the fair, but it was too late. There was no sign of Corey. No one could explain how a boy could disappear in broad daylight with hundreds of people nearby. Some thought he ran away. Others blamed the carnival workers. A few whispered that maybe he was taken, but no one wanted to believe something so dark could happen here. Over the weeks that followed, search parties combed the nearby woods and ponds. Helicopters scanned the area. Flyers went up in every storefront window, but no clues surfaced. Just a smiling photo of a boy in a striped shirt who walked into the fair and never came home. The fairgrounds were locked up by midnight, the string lights still flickering as volunteers swept popcorn and trampled flyers into trash bags. By then, the search for Corey had already begun in earnest. Deputies moved through the rows of vendor tents, asking workers if they'd seen a boy matching his description. Most just shook their heads or gave vague answers: too many faces, too much noise, easy to miss one kid in a crowd. A few remembered him playing the ring toss game for a long time, focused and determined, but none could say where he went afterward. By morning, Corey's photo was being passed from hand to hand. Local radio stations interrupted their usual broadcasts to describe the missing boy with sandy brown hair and wide blue eyes. The entire town of Milton felt it. At the post office, people stopped talking when his name came up. At the diner, waitresses whispered to each other behind the coffee counter. Teachers at his school cried in empty classrooms. He had simply vanished, and it didn't feel possible. Ben Wilkes barely spoke those first few days. He sat by the phone, eyes fixed on the front door like he expected Corey to walk in with sticky fingers and a sheepish smile. When asked what he remembered, Ben repeated the same story. Corey had won a pile of tickets, said he was going to redeem them, and told Ben to wait near the cotton candy cart. It was supposed to be 15 minutes. Maybe 20. But the fair buzzed on and the sun dipped lower and lower, and Corey never came back. His mother, Nancy Wilkes, was inconsolable. She clutched one of Corey's t-shirts to her chest and refused to sleep. She called his name into the woods behind their house, then stood in the silence, waiting for a response she would never get. At night she left the porch light on, convinced it would guide him home. Police questioned every vendor and worker, but most had already packed up and moved on to the next town. No one had taken a photo of the crowd near the ring toss booth. No one remembered anything strange. In a town that rarely made headlines, Corey's disappearance became the defining scar. and as the weeks stretched into months, hope slowly thinned into quiet resignation. Lila sat alone in the back of the records room, the hum of the overhead lights blending with the shuffle of old case files as she flipped through the folder marked Wilkes, Corey, Missing Person, 1984. The papers were yellowed, the ink on some barely legible. Her fingers brushed across old witness statements, search grids, and a copy of the missing poster with Corey's school photo printed at the center. His expression was a mix of nerves and forced confidence, that fragile middle ground kids his age so often carried. It was hard to believe no one had seen what happened to him. Harder still to believe that, after all this time, the first clue to surface was a bundle of prize tickets found stuffed inside a forgotten locker in a building about to be torn down. She turned another page and stopped at a timeline scribbled in red pen. The fair had started at noon, and Corey's last confirmed sighting had been around 4:20, near the ring toss. After that, nothing. Several people reported seeing him earlier in the day at the balloon darts, the lemonade stand, standing in line for the tilt-a-whirl, but no one could recall seeing him after he'd said he was heading to redeem his tickets. Lila leaned back, letting the pages rest on her lap. Something about the locker didn't sit right. It wasn't just that the tickets had turned up, it was where they'd turned up. A middle school locker. Not a dumpster, or someone's attic, or buried in the woods. Someone had taken the time to hide them, or maybe stash them in panic. The question was why? If someone wanted the tickets gone, why keep them at all? She flipped back to the property report. Locker 309. The school had closed in 1986 due to funding cuts, just 2 years after Corey vanished. Records might still exist, listing which student had been assigned that locker, assuming they were preserved. If she could find the right boxes, the right drawer, maybe even a yearbook, she might be able to put a name to it. And if she could put a name to it, she could ask a long overdue question. What did that student know about Corey Wilkes? And why had his tickets been sealed away in silence for over a decade? The archives at Milton Unified School District were kept in the basement of the administration building, a place that smelled like dust, cardboard, and old copier ink. Lila signed the ledger with a quick scrawl and followed the clerk through a maze of shelving units until they reached a long metal drawer labeled Student Locker Assignments, 1984 to 1986. The clerk stepped aside with a shrug, muttering that most of it hadn't been touched in years. Lila thanked him and began pulling folders one by one, her fingers methodical, careful not to tear any of the aging paper. It didn't take long to find the page for Milton Middle School, fall semester of 1984. Locker numbers were listed in numerical order, followed by each student's name, homeroom, and grade. When her eyes landed on 309, her pulse quickened. It had been assigned to a student named Randy Culp, 8th grade, homeroom 2B. She whispered the name aloud, testing it, letting it hang in the stale air. It meant nothing to her yet, just a name, but now she had a thread, and she knew better than to ignore the first tug. Back at her desk, she typed the name into the county database and waited. The computer screen flickered before pulling up a brief history. Randy Culp had left Milton not long after the school closed in 1986. Juvenile records sealed, a few citations in neighboring counties over the years, petty theft, vandalism, one count of trespassing that was dropped, no serious charges, no arrest record past his teens. It wasn't much, but it was enough to raise her interest. She pulled out the yearbook from the same term, one she'd borrowed earlier from the Historical Society. Flipping through the pages, she found Randy's photo in the 8th grade section. Shaggy dark hair, a sideways smirk, one of those faces you'd expect to be in the principal's office more than in class. He sat in the middle row in his homeroom photo, arms folded like he didn't want to be there. If Randy had Corey's prize tickets in his locker, there were only two possibilities. Either he found them and kept them for some strange reason, or he had them because he was there, because he saw something. Or did something. Either way, It was time to find out where Randy Culp had gone, and whether he'd ever answered the question everyone in Milton had stopped asking. Ben Wilkes hadn't spoken to a detective in years. After the first wave of investigations died down in the mid-'80s, there had been a handful of follow-ups, new officers hoping for fresh insight, reporters sniffing around for anniversary pieces, but none had brought anything new. Most visits felt like someone reopening a wound that never really healed. So when Lila Monroe showed up on his porch in 1995 with an envelope of prize tickets in her hand and Corey's name on her lips, Ben didn't invite her in right away. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, scanning her face like he was still deciding whether to trust the interruption. Lila kept her tone even. She explained what had been found at the school, where it turned up, and the name she'd traced it to. She said the town had forgotten too easily, and that maybe someone needed to remember more deliberately. That softened Ben a little. He stepped back and nodded for her to follow. Inside, the house was quiet. A small bookshelf sat beside the fireplace, and above it hung the only framed photo of Corey still on display. It was from a fishing trip the summer before he vanished, the two of them standing knee-deep in a lake, Corey holding a bluegill like it was something grand. Ben sat down slowly, his hands resting on his knees, and listened as Lila laid out what she knew. He hadn't heard the name Randy Culp in years, but when she said it, something lit behind his eyes, not quite recognition, more like caution. He remembered Randy being one of the older kids who hung around the bleachers, the kind who'd flick your ear just because he could. Corey had mentioned him once, saying he'd tried to cut in front of him at the prize booth. Ben hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Just middle school drama. Nothing serious. Lila asked if he had anything from that day, anything at all. Ben stood and disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he was holding a small shoebox. Inside were photos, newspaper clippings, and a few of Corey's belongings. Among them was a faded photo from the fair. Corey stood near the ring toss booth, smiling. And behind him, half obscured by the booth's canvas flap, was a teenage boy with dark shaggy hair and a sideways smirk. Lila studied the photo under the lamp at her desk, fingers tapping slowly as her eyes followed every blurred detail. Corey stood front and center, holding his prize tickets like they were currency that mattered. The ring toss booth behind him looked exactly as described in the original statements: striped awning, rows of glass bottles, faded stuffed animals hanging overhead. But it wasn't Corey she kept coming back to. It was the figure lurking just behind the curtain flap. The boy's face was partially shadowed, but the hair and expression matched Randy Culp's yearbook photo almost exactly. His posture was relaxed, one hand tucked in his back pocket, but his eyes were locked on Corey in a way that didn't sit right. She had the photo copied and placed it beside the one from the yearbook. The resemblance was unmistakable. If Randy had been hanging around the game booths that day, why hadn't he been mentioned in the original witness reports? Either no one noticed him, or no one thought his presence meant anything. Lila leaned back, thinking through what she had. A name, a locker, a photo. But no proof of wrongdoing. Not yet. Still, it was enough to widen the scope. Digging further into the fair's personnel list from that year, she noticed something odd. Several booths had temporary workers hired off the books, cash paid, no last names recorded. There was one note scribbled on a ledger from a carnival subcontractor: Eddie, helped at ring toss free, sat, gone by Sunday. No address, no follow-up, just a first name and a checkmark. Another person who vanished into the blur of the crowd just after Corey did. She cross-checked missing persons reports from nearby counties and found something else. 2 other boys had gone missing between 1982 and 1985, both during local fairs, different towns. Same setup. Ages between 10 and 13. Both cases had gone cold. It was too early to draw a line between them, but the pattern whispered beneath the surface. Boys at fairs, boys with tickets in hand, boys who never came home. If Randy had seen something, or worse, been involved, Someone else might have pulled the strings, and if this Eddie existed, Lila was going to find him. Somewhere out there, the path Corey vanished down was still waiting to be walked backward. The town of Milton didn't talk about the fair anymore. Not the way they used to. What had once been a point of pride ribbons, parades, fried food contests had slowly faded into something quieter, more uneasy. After Corey vanished, attendance dropped. Parents kept their kids close. Vendors complained about lost income. By the end of the decade, the county had stopped funding it altogether, letting the once cherished tradition wither under the weight of unspoken memories. And yet, pieces of that day still lingered, tucked into the corners of attics, basements, and dusty photo albums. Lila walked into the county archive building with a purpose. She'd called ahead, asked if anyone had kept the original booth permits or vendor applications from 1984. The clerk, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a coffee stain on his tie, led her to a narrow aisle and pulled down a heavy file box marked Carnival 1980s. Inside were faded permits, ledger sheets, and scribbled applications, some in ballpoint, others in pencil, all layered with the same scent of dry paper and time. She sorted through them carefully, looking for anything tied to the ring toss booth. Most had company names listed, like Midstate Games or Leisure Rides, but a few included handwritten notes from supervisors. One name popped up again, Eddie. No last name, but his first name was next to a booth assignment in 3 separate documents. Once in Fairview in 1982, again in Pine Bluff in 1983, and then Milton in 1984. Each time, the name had been checked off, and each time, no additional info was given. It was clear he'd been hired as a casual laborer, no ID, no address, just a handshake and a promise to work the booth for 2 days. Lila stared at the paper, her mind turning. If Eddie was real, and if he'd moved from town to town during that window, it was entirely possible he'd come and gone without ever being traced. The fairs made it easy. Cash pay, seasonal setups, no background checks, and if he had something to hide, all he had to do was keep moving. She slid the papers back into their envelope and whispered under her breath that she'd find him. Somewhere out there was a man who knew what happened to Corey Wilkes. And if he was still alive, he'd made one mistake too many. Lila sat on the edge of the motel bed, flipping through the notes she'd gathered over the past week. A map of Nebraska counties was spread across the bedspread, dotted with yellow pushpins marking the fairground locations where this mysterious Eddie had reportedly worked. 3 pins, 3 towns, 3 boys who had vanished within a few years of each other. It was the kind of pattern that didn't scream for attention, but whispered in a way that stayed under your skin. The Pine Bluff case stood out the most. In 1983, a 12-year-old named Jeremy Lyles disappeared during the final night of the town's annual rodeo and fair. Just like Corey, he'd last been seen near a game booth, reportedly holding a stack of prize tickets. The local sheriff at the time had treated it like a runaway case, no signs of abduction, no struggle, and no body ever found. But the eerie overlap with Corey's story was too much for Lila to chalk up to coincidence. She made a call to the Pine Bluff Records office and was transferred twice before an older clerk named Reggie answered. His voice crackled through the line, but he remembered the case, said his sister had gone to school with Jeremy. When Lila asked if there had been any suspects, he hesitated before mentioning that a drifter named Eddie had worked the fair that year. The sheriff questioned him briefly, but let him go when nothing seemed off. Reggie added that Eddie disappeared the next morning, and no one ever followed up. That night, Lila drove to the edge of town and parked outside the old fairgrounds in Milton. The field was overgrown now, the remnants of carnival life reduced to rusted poles and weathered boards. She stepped out of her car and walked the perimeter slowly, her flashlight beam catching bits of twisted metal and faded signage buried in the tall grass. Somewhere out here, Corey had taken his last known steps. Somewhere near these empty booths, he had been offered something. Maybe a prize, maybe a lie. She stopped at the spot where the ring toss had once stood, closed her eyes, and tried to imagine it as it had been. The noise, the color, the laughter. And then the silence that followed. The part no one could explain. Not yet, but it was getting closer. Nancy Wilkes had grown used to silence. Not just the silence of a house without footsteps, but the kind that settled into her bones over time. The kind that made ordinary sounds, clock ticks, floor creaks, distant lawnmowers, feel louder than they should. After Corey disappeared, people had come by in waves. Neighbors brought casseroles, church friends offered prayers, reporters knocked politely at first, then stopped asking. And slowly, the world shrank until it was just her and the empty bedroom at the end of the hall. When Lila knocked on her door, Nancy opened it with wary eyes. She hadn't spoken about Corey in years, not to someone official. The detective introduced herself gently and said she'd found something. At the mention of a locker and the prize tickets inside, Nancy didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped aside and quietly motioned for Lila to come in. They sat in the living room, a space untouched by fashion or time. The same floral curtains, the same crocheted blanket folded on the armrest. A framed photo of Corey rested on the mantel, his smile permanent, unchanged by the years. Lila asked if he'd ever mentioned anyone unusual at the fair, anyone who might have made him nervous. Nancy shook her head slowly, then paused. There was something. The night before the fair, Corey had come into the kitchen, asking what the biggest prize at the fair might be. She laughed and said probably a goldfish or a cheap stuffed bear, but he was fixated. Said someone at school told him there was a secret prize, something you had to earn enough tickets for, something they didn't put on the shelves. When she asked who told him that, he said it was a guy at the school gym who worked the fairs in the summer. He didn't give a name, just said the man promised him if he saved enough tickets, he could trade them in for something better than a toy. Nancy hadn't thought much of it at the time. Kids said all kinds of things. But the next morning, Corey had left the house early, excited, with his ticket pouch tied tight to his belt loop. He said he wanted to be one of the first in line at the booths. She never saw that pouch again. And now, 11 years later, someone had found it sealed in a locker, long after the boy who carried it vanished without a sound. Ben hadn't looked inside the shoebox in years. It lived at the back of his closet, wedged behind old boots and a stack of unpacked moving boxes from a life that had slowly drifted into routine. After Lila's visit, he pulled it out, cleared a space at the kitchen table, and opened it with the kind of reverence reserved for things both sacred and painful. The photos were bent at the corners, the ink on some starting to blur, but they still held moments that hadn't faded. Corey sitting on the porch with a melted popsicle, the two of them at the creek with fishing poles, their mother pretending not to cry behind the camera during his first day of school. Toward the bottom, wrapped in a paper napkin that had yellowed with age, was a small Polaroid he didn't remember taking. It was clearly from the fair. Corey stood near the edge of the ring toss booth, grinning, one foot slightly lifted like he'd just jumped back from excitement. What caught Ben's eye wasn't his brother, though it was the figure behind him. Not fully in the frame, but visible enough. A man wearing a red cap, leaning out from behind the booth's canvas panel. His face was turned slightly toward the camera, just enough for his features to be half recognizable. Ben stared at the photo, his pulse picking up. He didn't remember snapping it. He didn't remember the man. But something about the way the man's eyes fixed on Corey, even in the blur of the background, felt wrong. Not casual, not passing, intentional. When he handed the photo to Lila later that day, she sat with it for a long time. She compared it to the photos in the school yearbook and the vendor records. The man in the red cap didn't match Randy Culp, but that didn't matter. This wasn't Randy, this was someone else, possibly Eddie. She scanned the image and pinned it to the growing board in her office. Corey in the foreground, unaware and smiling. Behind him, a man half hidden, caught in the frame by accident or fate. One moment, one photo, one forgotten snapshot that just might have captured a piece of the truth they'd been chasing all along. The school was quiet now. Nothing left but crumbling tiles and the stale echo of footsteps on concrete. Demolition had been halted temporarily while city inspectors cleared out the last of the basement storage, and Lila saw an opportunity. She'd convinced the foreman to let her walk the lower levels one more time. With the discovery of the locker and the envelope, she had a feeling something else had been left behind, something no one thought to look for. The janitor who found the tickets, Phil Maddox, agreed to meet her near the south stairwell. He led her down into the underbelly of the building with a heavy flashlight and a quiet respect for the space. He pointed toward a set of old double doors that had remained locked since the school closed. According to Phil, they'd been used to store confiscated student property, broken equipment, and old seasonal decorations. It had been sealed off sometime in the late 80s after a leak ruined part of the ceiling. Lila worked the lock with some effort, and when the door finally gave way, a gust of musty air rolled out. The room beyond was cluttered with toppled shelves, plastic tubs, and decaying cardboard boxes. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark and caught glimpses of forgotten school life, deflated basketballs, water-stained textbooks, and faded posters peeling from the walls. Near the back, something caught her eye. A broken display case with a cracked glass front sat half-buried beneath collapsed shelving. Inside it, among shards of old trophies and track ribbons, was a plastic prize shelf like the kind you'd see at a carnival game booth. Small compartments labeled with ticket values still held a few trinkets, bouncy balls, plastic whistles, and cheap figurines. What drew her in was the top shelf, empty but clearly labeled with marker. Special prizes. 30 tickets. She stared at it, heart thudding. 30 was exactly how many tickets Corey had been holding when he vanished. There was nothing else in the display. No names, no records, just dust and silence. But something about its presence in a school storage room felt entirely wrong. This shelf wasn't part of any school program. It had been brought here, hidden, buried, and forgotten. Just like the boy who had never gotten the prize he was promised. Lila sat behind her desk long after the station had quieted for the night, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the stack of files spread out before her. She kept going back to the locker, the envelope, the broken prize shelf stored deep in the school basement. Nothing about it added up. A carnival prize display case tucked away behind sealed doors in a middle school? It didn't make sense unless someone brought it there on purpose. Not to use it, to hide it. She opened Randy Culp's juvenile record again. The file was thin, mostly minor offenses, skipping school, shoplifting, vandalism. But one note stood out. In October of 1984, 2 months after Corey vanished, Randy was brought in for questioning in an unrelated trespassing case. A patrol officer caught him inside the school after hours, claiming he'd lost a set of headphones. He was let go with a warning. But now, with everything she'd uncovered, that timing felt like more than coincidence. She flipped to the officer's statement. No mention of what Randy had been doing near the south stairwell or why he chose to use a side entrance instead of the main doors. But Lila had a theory. If Randy had something to do with the tickets, or if he'd taken something that belonged to Corey, maybe he wasn't just hiding the envelope. Maybe he was hiding evidence. And maybe that night in October, he'd come back to make sure it stayed hidden. The problem was, Randy had disappeared. After the school closed and a short stint in juvenile detention, he never enrolled in another district. His name didn't show up on employment records, tax filings, or driver registrations. It was as if he'd stepped off the grid before adulthood ever found him. She stared at his yearbook photo pinned on the board beside Corey's and the man in the red cap. The connections were faint but real. Randy, the last person tied to the locker. Corey, the boy with 30 tickets in hand. And Eddie, the drifter who worked the booth and vanished just as fast. 3 names, 3 missing pieces. Lila reached for the phone and made a quiet promise to herself. One of them knew what happened that day. And she was going to find out which one had been carrying the secret all along. The knock at the door came just after dusk, when the street lamps were flickering on and the last rays of sun stretched long across the fields. Gina Trotter hadn't expected company. She lived alone in a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, tucked behind rows of wind-blown sycamores. When she opened the door and saw Detective Monroe standing there, holding a photo in her hand, her face changed instantly. Not from fear, but something quieter recognition she hadn't planned to show anyone. Lila introduced herself and explained she was reopening the Wilkes case. Gina's name had surfaced in an old witness list from 1984, but no official statement had ever been taken. Most people back then had been eager to say something just to be helpful, but Gina had been different. At the time, only 14, and known to keep to herself, she never pushed to be heard. Now, at nearly 30, she looked at the photo Lila handed her with a silence that spoke more than any words. It was the Polaroid, the one with Corey at the ring toss booth and the figure behind him in the red cap. Gina's eyes lingered on it, and her voice came low and measured. She said she remembered that day better than she wished she did. Corey had been laughing, running between booths, proudly waving his ticket bundle like it was gold. She'd been near the bleachers, watching from a distance, when she saw Randy Culp walk up behind him. They talked for a minute, and then Corey followed him around the back of the booth where the crowd thinned out. Gina remembered thinking it was strange. Randy wasn't someone Corey usually hung around with, but before she could go check, a group of kids distracted her, and by the time she turned back, they were both gone. She'd told a teacher the next day, but no one followed up. Maybe it didn't seem important. Maybe people didn't want to believe someone local could be involved. She'd carried that moment with her ever since, tucked away like a stone in her pocket. Lila thanked her and promised she would keep her name confidential for now. But inside, she knew something had shifted. For the first time, someone had seen what happened just before Corey vanished. And it changed everything. The sun had barely risen when Lila returned to the old school grounds, this time with a warrant in hand and a city crew in tow. The demolition team had paused work indefinitely after her request, and now the crawlspace behind the south wall directly adjacent to the sealed storage room was the focus. Blueprints showed a strange void in the foundation, a dead space with no clear purpose. If someone had hidden something back there, it had remained untouched for over a decade. The crew drilled carefully, clearing the cinder block one piece at a time. Dust hung thick in the air, and the narrow space beyond was dark, dry, and silent. Lila crouched beside the opening with her flashlight and ducked inside. The air was cooler here, stale but undisturbed, and her boots scraped against loose debris and torn insulation. In the far corner, behind a rusted beam and warped wood paneling, something caught her light, a small cloth bag, filthy and sagging, half buried in the dirt. She pulled it free and slowly opened the drawstring. Inside was a cracked plastic toy gun, the kind once given away at carnival booths. Alongside it, a keychain shaped like a sheriff's badge, the silver paint chipped and dull. And at the bottom, folded so many times it had started to tear at the edges, was a laminated fair map from 1984. One spot had been circled in red ink, Lot C, just beyond the food vendors. A place that had never been searched. Lila emerged from the crawl space and showed the evidence to the site foreman, then made a call back to the station. She requested ground-penetrating radar, a full forensic team, and a deputy to begin securing the perimeter of Lot C. If the map was right, and if the red circle meant what she feared it did, they were no longer looking for just pieces of a story. They were closing in on where that story ended. As she stood under the gray morning sky, holding that worn plastic badge in her palm, she realized she wasn't just following a trail anymore. She was walking back into the last place Corey Wilkes had ever been. And for the first time since reopening the case, she felt the weight of the truth pressing close, rising up from the ground beneath her feet. By late afternoon, Lot C had been cordoned off with yellow tape, and a forensic tent was being assembled at the far end of the gravel stretch where the red circle had been marked on the old fair map. The lot had long since been repurposed as an overflow parking area for the nearby water treatment facility, but in 1984 it had been the back edge of the fairgrounds. Unpaved, quiet, bordered by trees and machinery sheds, a place where foot traffic had thinned, where kids weren't supposed to wander but often did. The ground-penetrating radar team worked in slow, precise arcs across the soil. Their monitors lit up with digital impressions that revealed disturbances below the surface. Most were harmless rocks, piping, remnants of temporary fencing, but one signal near the eastern edge stood out. Roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, with an outline that mirrored the shape of a shallow trench. It sat just beneath a crumbling section of concrete poured in the early 90s, likely during the lot's repaving. Whatever had been buried there had remained untouched for over a decade. They broke the concrete first, section by section, revealing compacted dirt beneath. As the digging began, Lila stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the deepening hole. The same cloth bag she'd found in the crawlspace rested on the hood of her cruiser, its toy gun and sheriff's badge now sealed in evidence bags, quiet relics of a day no one had wanted to remember. An hour passed, maybe more, before one of the deputies stopped digging. He'd struck something, not metal, not rock. The corner of a cloth-wrapped shape, pale and brittle, just peeking through the dirt. He called for the forensic lead, and slowly, with care, the team uncovered what they now feared they'd find. It wasn't just fabric. It was part of a shirt, faded red and white stripes. Beneath it, the edge of a small sneaker, the sole still faintly patterned despite the years underground. Lila stepped closer, not saying a word. She didn't have to. They had found him. The search for Corey Wilkes had begun with a rusted locker and a forgotten envelope of prize tickets. It had ended here, in the far corner of a gravel lot, where a boy's final steps had been buried in silence and time. The following morning, the town of Milton woke to the kind of news it had quietly dreaded for over a decade. A body had been recovered. Human remains found beneath a concrete slab behind the old fairgrounds. Though officials hadn't released a name, no one needed to ask. They all knew. For those who had grown up with Corey Wilkes, who remembered his laugh or the way he darted between booths with a prize ticket clutched in one hand, it was like a wound reopened. The story that had never ended now had a final, heartbreaking chapter. The forensic team worked through the night. Preliminary analysis confirmed the remains belonged to a boy estimated to be between 11 and 13. Braces were still attached to the jawbone, the kind that had been discontinued in the late 80s. Clothing matched the description Nancy Wilkes had given back in 1984, a red and white striped shirt, blue jeans, white canvas sneakers with loose laces. In the boy's pocket they found the edge of what had once been a fairground ticket, so faded it was barely legible, but it was there, just one. Like something he'd meant to keep. Lila sat quietly at her desk, reviewing the scene photos. The bag of belongings, the shallow grave, the layout of Lot C, none of it looked accidental. Someone had chosen that spot. Someone had taken the time to bury him, to cover the ground, and eventually walk away as if it would stay hidden forever. She glanced at the board on the wall, the faces pinned there in a rough triangle. Corey, Randy Culp, and the man in the red cap. Corey was no longer missing. He had been found. Now it was time to understand why. Ben Wilkes came to the station just before noon. Lila met him outside, away from the press trucks and prying eyes. She told him gently, explained the process, and said that formal identification would come within days. But he didn't need the lab results. He just nodded, quietly, eyes fixed on the pavement. Then he asked the only question that mattered now: who did this? Lila didn't answer right away, because the truth was she still didn't know. But someone did. And whoever had buried that boy had made a mistake. They'd left behind a trail. One that was no longer fading, but rising with every step she took. The media caught wind of the discovery faster than anyone expected. By evening, the story was on every local station, and within 24 hours, a reporter from Lincoln was standing outside the Milton Police Department broadcasting live. The headlines used the word closure, but Lila knew better. Closure implied an ending, a tying up of loose threads. What they had found was a beginning. The moment the truth shifted from whispers to something they could finally chase. The tips started coming in fast. Most were noise people claiming to remember strange men at the fair, neighbors convinced they'd seen Corey days after he disappeared, rumors recycled from old bar talk. But one name came up more than once: Edgar Tolliver, a drifter who had worked the fair circuit in the early 80s, including a stint at the Milton County Fair in 1984. One tip came from a woman in Pine Bluff who said she remembered her father arguing with a man by that name who had been hired to run a booth. Another came from an ex-carnival worker who recognized the man in the red cap from the Polaroid and swore his name had been Eddie. Lila cross-referenced every mention of him with the old fair records. There was no formal employee file, but cash payments to subcontracted vendors often skipped paperwork. A few scribbled ledgers listed him only as Eddie, ring toss, 2 days. He had left town the morning after Corey vanished. No one had heard from him since. She reached out to state parole offices and finally hit something solid. Edgar Tolliver had done time in Missouri for burglary, served 3 years, and was released in 1985. No known address after that. No updated ID. But an old mugshot sat in the system, graying hair, sunken eyes, and a faint scar running along his right jaw. When Lila compared it to the man in the photo behind Corey at the ring toss booth, it wasn't exact, but it was close enough to make her breath catch. She printed it out, taped it to the board beneath the word unknown, and drew a line connecting him to the red cap in the Polaroid. If this was Eddie, and if he'd disappeared the same day Corey did, then the man they were looking for hadn't just left town. He had been running for 11 years. Lila stared at the board in her office, lines of red thread stretching from name to name, photo to location, like a web slowly tightening around a single point. Edgar Tolliver wasn't a ghost, not anymore. He had a face, a record, and a history of vanishing just after something awful happened. 3 fairs, 3 boys. And now, after years of silence, he had a name again. The old mugshot was blurred at the corners, but there was no mistaking the scar on his jawline. It matched a faint mark just visible in the Polaroid of Corey at the ring toss booth. She handed everything over to the state investigator assigned to assist, who agreed it was enough to justify reopening the cases from Pine Bluff and Fairview. Together, they sent out a multi-state request to track any aliases or low-level offenses that might have put Tolliver's name into a local system. It took 2 days, but then something came back from Idaho. A man named Edward Tallman had been cited 6 months earlier for trespassing on private property. No arrest, just a warning and a photo on file. The image was newer, the features older and worn by time, but the scar was there. Same jawline, same eyes. They had found him. Lila packed a bag, cleared it with the chief, and booked a flight out the next morning. She wasn't leaving it to someone else. This was her case now, and if Tolliver had taken Corey's life, she was going to look him in the eye when he answered for it. The small town in Idaho wasn't much different from Milton, just more trees and fewer people. She met with the local sheriff and showed him the file, the photos, the timeline. He agreed to help coordinate. They drove out to the edge of town where Tolliver, living under his alias, worked maintenance at an old roadside motel. When they pulled in, Lila stayed in the passenger seat, watching him sweep the parking lot with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired, faded into the background, like he'd spent years practicing invisibility. But when the sheriff called his name, his real name, he froze. His hand tightened around the broom handle. His shoulders stiffened. And for the first time since 1984, Edgar Tolliver turned toward the past he had buried. Edgar Tolliver didn't try to run. When the sheriff said his name, the real one, not the alias he'd been using for the last decade, he simply turned and stared. Lila watched from a few feet back, her badge visible but her voice quiet. She wanted him to see her, to understand that this moment had been a long time coming. That a boy he thought the world had forgotten had never really disappeared, not in the way he'd hoped. Tolliver's hands trembled slightly as they were cuffed. He didn't protest, didn't shout or curse. He asked only one thing, if this was about the fair. Lila nodded. He looked down and said nothing else. On the drive back to the station, he sat in silence, staring out the window at the passing trees like they might offer some way back to a version of himself that no longer existed. The interview room was small, a desk, 2 chairs, and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. Lila laid out the file piece by piece. The Polaroid of Corey, the red cap, the cloth bag found beneath the school, the prize shelf labeled 30 tickets. She didn't ask if he remembered. She didn't need to. She asked why. Tolliver stayed quiet for a long time. His fingers tapped against the table, not fast, just steady, like a slow countdown. Then his voice broke the silence. He said he never meant for things to go that far, that it started as a game, that Corey was just supposed to follow Randy, just supposed to scare him a little, keep him quiet, but something went wrong. Corey fought back. He panicked. Tolliver lost control. He said he buried him in the lot because he didn't know what else to do. Said he'd gone back twice, once to move the evidence, once to make sure no one had found it. When he saw the concrete being poured, he believed it was over, that the past had been sealed shut for good. Lila let him finish. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she pressed the recorder stop button and stood. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph, just weight. The weight of a truth that had taken 11 years to surface. The weight of a child's story finally told, even if it had been buried first. News of Edgar Tolliver's arrest moved quickly, but the details were carefully managed. The town of Milton, once gripped by unanswered questions and stretched thin by years of quiet suspicion, received confirmation with a mixture of shock and solemn relief. The man who had eluded them for over a decade wasn't a stranger from far away, not anymore. He had lived among others in plain sight, tucked behind a false name and a quiet life that gave no hint of the past he had buried. Back in Milton, the forensic team finalized their report. The remains recovered from Lot C were officially identified as Corey Wilkes using dental records and a DNA match from Ben. It was a confirmation everyone had expected, but still, when the envelope came through with the lab results, Lila sat in her car for a long time before opening it. It wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a boy's final chapter, written in loss, silence, and now, truth. She met with Ben and Nancy Wilkes in person. The family had waited a long time to hear the words spoken plainly, not speculated or whispered behind doors. Lila explained how they found Corey, how the evidence had led to Tolliver, and what he had finally admitted in the interview room. She offered to let them read the full transcript, but Nancy declined. All she needed to know was that someone had cared enough to finish the story even when everyone else had stopped searching. Ben sat quietly, the weight of years settling on his shoulders in a way that looked like both grief and release. He asked how the locker was found, how something so small had pulled the whole truth to the surface. Lila told him about Phil Maddox, about the broken door, about the envelope sealed shut with time and dust. It had started with nothing more than a janitor's curiosity and ended with justice returning home. They planned a memorial for the following week, not a funeral. Corey had already been mourned in 100 ways, over 1,000 quiet mornings. This would be something else. A way to give him back to the town, a place where his name would no longer be a question, but a memory spoken freely at last. The memorial was held beneath a stretch of oak trees just outside town, in the same park where the county fair had once opened each summer with parades and lemonade stands. Now, the grounds were quieter, no booths or music, just rows of folding chairs set in a semicircle and a wooden platform beneath a white canopy. There was no casket, no funeral procession. What they had recovered of Corey had already been laid to rest quietly with family. This gathering was for the rest of the town, for those who remembered the boy in the striped shirt and the smile that had lingered in missing posters far longer than anyone had expected. Ben stood at the front and spoke first. His words were simple, unpolished, but honest. He talked about the last day he saw his brother, how they'd split a root beer and argued over which game had better prizes. He said he had lived with guilt for a long time, but not because he thought he could have stopped it, because he feared no one would ever care enough to try again. Then he turned to Lila, seated quietly near the back, and nodded. That guilt, he said, had lessened when someone finally did. Nancy didn't speak, but she sat holding a photo of Corey in her lap, her hands steady. She had aged in the way grief ages a person, not suddenly, but with slow erosion, one quiet day at a time. Now, for the first time, the silence didn't feel hollow, it felt full. Not of answers, exactly, but of knowing. After the service, people lingered. Neighbors who hadn't seen each other in years embraced. Former teachers placed flowers beneath the photo board. A few kids, too young to remember the case, stood beside their parents and asked who Corey was. And in that telling, his story passed into memory. As the crowd thinned, Lila remained by the tree line, her badge tucked away, her hands in her coat pockets. She hadn't grown up here. Corey wasn't part of her childhood. But standing there, she understood what it meant to bring someone home. Not just to solve the mystery, but to give back a name, a place, and the truth that had waited patiently to be heard. 2 weeks after the memorial, the rusted locker that had started it all was quietly moved from the demolition site and into the care of the Milton Historical Society. It had been cleaned and stabilized, its dents and corrosion preserved instead of erased, the number 309 still faintly visible in chipped paint above the handle. Inside, a small display had been arranged with care, a copy of the envelope that once held the prize tickets, a replica of the toy sheriff's badge, and a laminated photo of Corey Wilkes standing at the ring toss booth, smiling at something just outside the frame. The exhibit was small, tucked in a corner near the back of the museum beside a glass case of local fair memorabilia. But people came. Some brought their kids. Others stood quietly for a long time, just looking. Not everyone had known Corey well, but his disappearance had cast a shadow over the town for years, lingering in ways no one fully acknowledged. Now, the locker stood as both a tribute and a reminder. The silence that had settled in Milton was no longer a void. It was filled with the sound of names spoken again, with stories passed down, with truth reclaimed. Lila visited on her day off. She didn't sign the guest book. She didn't speak to the museum staff. She just walked in, stood in front of the locker, and let the quiet of the space wrap around her. The weight of the case had shifted, no longer pressing down on her, but sitting beside her like something that could finally rest. In the photograph, Corey looked like any other kid caught mid-laugh young, full of the kind of hope only found in summer afternoons and games that cost a nickel a throw. She reached out and touched the glass gently, then stepped back and nodded once, as if in answer to a question no one had asked aloud. Outside, the wind was rising through the trees, the same trees that bordered the park and once lined the edge of the fairgrounds. Somewhere beneath them, laughter had faded. And then, years later, a voice had returned to finish what the town never meant to forget. Late one evening, long after the last file had been boxed and archived, Lila found herself back at her desk with the envelope, the original one. The same brittle paper with Corey's name in fading blue ink. She'd kept it longer than she was supposed to, not out of protocol, but because it never quite felt finished. Even now, with the case closed, the suspect in custody, and the truth finally spoken out loud, something in her needed to hold it just a little longer. She thought about the janitor, Phil Maddox, and how it had all started with a locker that wouldn't open. One stubborn door in an abandoned hallway had cracked a silence that had lasted for 11 years. She thought about Ben Wilkes and the shoebox of memories that held the last photograph of a brother who never got to grow up. She thought about the fairgrounds, about Lot C, about how easily a place of joy could fold into a place of sorrow when no one was looking. And she thought about Corey, not as a headline, not as a file, but as a boy who had laughed and run and believed in something as simple as a secret prize for 30 tickets. He hadn't known the world could break like that. He had trusted like most kids do. Trusted the game, the people around him, the promise of something bright just beyond the counter. In the morning, Lila would return the envelope to evidence, where it would rest in a locked cabinet with a number and a label. But that night, she let it sit on the desk in front of her a little longer. She leaned back in her chair, listening to the hum of the building, the distant creak of heating pipes, and thought about the sound of a ring hitting glass bottles, the low murmur of a crowd, and a boy's laughter slipping out into the warm air before vanishing completely. Some cases leave you with questions that echo long after the answers are found. Others remind you why the search matters at all. And some, like this one, leave behind nothing louder than the quiet return of a name, Corey Wilkes. Finally spoken, finally heard, finally home.